Hey, everybody. It is a blessing to be here with you tonight. Whether you're a friend, a visitor, a brother, a sister, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. We're going to continue our study looking through the prophets tonight. We'll be in Daniel chapters 8 and 9. And as we get into it, just to kind of throw it out there, these are some of the most variously or widely interpreted chapters in the Bible, in particular, chapter 9 with its 70 weeks. This is the section of Daniel that people use to predict the end of the universe. And so if you've ever heard of a prediction of the end of the world, which seems to happen more often than one might think, if you've heard somebody predicting that they know when the end of the world is, it is almost certainly based upon Daniel chapter 9, at least relatively recent, like from the 19th century up until today. People are using this section of the book of Daniel to try and tell you when the end of all things is coming. So we're going to look at that. We'll pay attention to the timeline, and we'll see what it is, at least one possible explanation for what it is that Daniel is being told in the visions that he's receiving. And so with that, let's just jump in, and we'll kind of pick up where we left off, going with the flow in Daniel, and we're going to be in chapter 8. And so in chapter 8, we're going to have some more visions. We're going to see two beasts in this chapter, and it's a direct reference, or it correlates directly to what we saw before in chapter 7, and then with the other visions that we have seen, Nebuchadnezzar's statue, dealing with these kingdoms that are coming. And it's always going to be the same four kingdoms, or at least kingdoms from those four. So in Nebuchadnezzar's statue, you have the head and kind of the chest, and then the waist and the legs, and you have these different parts and their different kingdoms, and you have Babylon, and then the Medo-Persian Empire, and then Greece, and then Rome on the bottom. Then you get to the beasts that we saw in the previous chapter, and you have the same thing. It's going to be Babylon, and then the Medo-Persian Empire, and then the Grecian Empire, technically the Macedonian Empire, although the Macedonians consider themselves to be Greeks, but the Greeks disagreed, and so they fought a war, and Macedon wins. And so you continue down, that Macedonia wins, and you continue down, and then you get to Rome again. And so now we get to this vision in chapter 8, and Daniel is going to see two of the beasts, or two kingdoms represented by beasts, from all of the other things that have been going on in the chapter, or in the book. So nothing is really new, but you are getting new information about the things that are going to happen. And so it's helpful to pause for just a minute and look at history. And maybe in the past, history hasn't been something that was very interesting to you. And I'm convinced, as somebody who studied history, I'm convinced that people don't like it because they're not given a purpose for it. If history is just a bunch of names and dates and figures and maps and charts, boring. But if history has a purpose, if there's a story being told, if we're moving forward to get somewhere, then all of a sudden, like a great novel unfolding in front of you, the pages of history now have meaning. You're going somewhere. You're not just learning dates and far-off places for the sake of learning those. You're part of a narrative. You're part of a story that's unfolding, and that is the biblical presentation of history. It's so much more interesting than just reading a book about names and places that you don't know. But God's view of history is that everything is interconnected, and throughout all human history, God is working to bring about his divine plan, which he put in motion, or he thought of, before the foundation of the world. And from the very creation itself, God has put his plan to save humanity into action. You can see this in places like Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, where the Apostle Paul is going to say that before the foundation of the world, God put these things in place to save us. You can see in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5, where Paul talks about how we were predestined in Christ. And what he's saying there is that back before the foundation of the world, God determined that he was going to save people in Jesus. Right? That's the plan. That's what he's saying. Jesus is the plan. And so the point of history, looking at all the things that have happened, is to get to Jesus. And in this vision, in chapter 8 and in chapter 9, these explanations, they're moving us toward Jesus. That's the point, right? He is the purpose of history. Everything before him is running up to him, and everything after him is being remade. Humanity is being remade into his image. We are becoming image bearers of God in the new creation, or in the image of Jesus, the Son of God, come in the flesh. So that's what we're seeing here. Before creation, God has put these things into effect, into plan. And so God is acting throughout human history. Indeed, this is going to be something that is said over in Acts chapter 2 when the Apostle Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost, and he's going to talk about the foreordained or predetermined plan of God. God had a plan in place, and the political machinations of the Jews to use Rome to get rid of this upstart schemer in their view, it was something that God put in place from before the foundation of the world to bring about the redemption of humanity. And so God is acting through history. That village amongst the 7 hills in the Tiber grows into great prominence and becomes the Roman Empire for the express purpose of becoming a vehicle for Christianity to move to all nations. That's why. That's why it's there, so that God can carry out his plan. The empires rising and falling in the Middle East, even though they have some weird names sometimes, the purpose of their rising and falling is to bring about the Christ. And so when you read the pages of history, you're actually reading God working through the actions of human beings to bring about his ultimate plan, the result that he desires, the salvation of all people. So God is acting throughout history. So what we'll do is just very briefly, we talked a little bit about some history last time. We're going to look just very briefly at some history that will help us kind of put things into perspective. And so the very first thing that we're going to look at is the Persian Empire. Now, it has a couple different names. We've called it the Medo-Persian Empire already because it kind of starts as this loose association or alliance between the Medes and the Persians to fight against a couple other powers that are in the region. It's also called the Achaemenid, right? Or Achaemenid. There we go. I'll say it right in a minute. The Achaemenid Empire. And it's also just called the Persian Empire. Most people call it the Persian Empire because it's easier to say, and Persia was kind of the great power. They were the force behind it. It's in modern-day Iran, and so this image that's on the screen down there is actually a Persian drinking vessel, and if you'll notice what's on the front of it, or what's on the bottom of it, it's a ram. Right? Rams were very important to Persia. The crest of the king that he would wear out into battle when they went to go fight was a ram. And so it's very, very significant. The guardian spirit, or the god who guarded the empire of Persia, took the form of a ram. And so when you think of Persia, think rams. The next nation that we're going to talk about, or what would happen, we'll give you some background. With Persia, Cyrus the Great is going to take control of the Median Empire in 553 BC. And it's going to roll into the Medo-Persian Empire. And he's going to go through the region and conquer everything, eventually even taking over the Neo-Babylonian Empire and their capital, Babylon, which we saw previously in chapter 5. Right? And so what we're seeing now is, when we're in chapter 7 and 8 and 9, is we're seeing events that are kind of happening at the tail end of that and just after that takeover. In 539, again, they're going to conquer Babylon, and they're going to move into Greece even in the 4th century. And if you're Greek and Persians invade, that makes you really mad. And so that's going to bring us then into the next empire, which is the Macedonian Empire. People often call it the Greek Empire. Technically, it's Macedonian. But if you're from any other place, it's all Greek, right? There's no distinction. They speak Greek, they act Greek, they are Greek. It would just be like somebody from New York claiming to live in New Jersey. The people in Jersey would be like, get out of here. That's kind of how it was. And so Alexander the Great is the person we think of, but really his father, Philip, is the one that kind of sets things in motion. Philip spends the early part of his reign developing the Macedonian military. He retrains the soldiers, he teaches them new tactics, he gets some new equipment, he develops new weapons, new theory behind weapons, and he really does a masterful job of organizing the military and putting the political backing amongst the Greek city-states in place to kind of unite them together. There's a little quibble between Alexander and Philip magically winds up dead, and Alexander gets control of the empire. Alexander doesn't really like politics, and so he just conquers Greece. And then he pushes on, because again, if you're Greek, and the Macedonians consider themselves Greek, and Persia has invaded Greece, you don't want them there. And so he pushes them out. And he doesn't stop. He's like, well, fighting Persians is easy. So he keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. And Alexander the Great will get control of the empire, of the Macedonian Empire, in about 334, 336-ish. And he'll begin invading, or 338, and he'll begin invading in 334. He'll be done conquering Persia, conquering the world in 326. So in less than 10 years, he conquers what is considered the world at that time, if you're Greek. I mean, everything in less than 10 years. It's absolutely amazing. It would have been thought to be impossible. If somebody predicted that you were going to conquer the world in less than 10 years, they would have said you're crazy. But Alexander, he never lost a battle. When he was in command, if he is on the battlefield, the Macedonians win every single time. Well, he will die in 323. And when he dies, the legend is that he's asked who his heir will be, and he says the strongest or something like that. really what happened is he did have an heir, but he was an infant. And so the Grecian Empire is divided in half. People back in Greece thought they had the leader. People further east thought they had the leader. And then that winds up getting split into fours, where you have Alexander's generals, who were in charge of the military, incidentally, wind up controlling 4 chunks of the Macedonian Empire, which are never quite as strong as the whole. And that will cause, over time, these different city-states or these different regions, empires, to wane as that village in the 7 hills grows stronger and stronger. And that brings us to Rome. So the Roman standard, it's an eagle sitting atop a plaque which says SPQR, which is the Senate and People of Rome. That's what that stands for. And so every army went out under the authority of the Senate and the people of Rome, at least in theory. So what happens is Rome, during all this time, Rome is growing and becoming more powerful. They're unifying the Italian peninsula, and they're going to get involved in some wars called the Punic Wars, which is actually with Carthage. Why they're not called the Carthaginian Wars, we can argue about that later, but they're called the Punic Wars. During the Second Punic War, they fight 3 of them. During the second one, the Romans discover Macedonian envoys on a boat with the Carthaginians. And so they're not happy. And so they start causing all kinds of trouble with the Greeks, but they're really trying to destroy Carthage. And so they go ahead and finish that. And then from that point forward, Rome hates Greece. I mean, they like them, they steal their gods, they appropriate their culture, all of those things, but they really, really don't like Greece from that point forward, and they're going to conquer them. And so they slowly put into place political machinations, sowing discord, causing the Greek city-states to fight with one another and weaken each other, causing trouble between the different Greek generals or the ruling families in those 4 nations that we talked about earlier. And eventually, Rome is going to kind of do the divide and conquer thing, where they slowly pick apart Alexander's empire until they rule all of it in 63 AD, with Pompey Magnus, or Pompey the Great, marching through Judea and taking over the last vestige of the empire. And he'll famously walk into the temple and say that there was nothing there. And so that's what happens. And this is going to take place all the way through, up until about 63 AD. Then Greece will be there, and then Rome takes control. The Ptolemaic kingdom, the last kingdom, will ultimately finally come to an end officially in about 30 BC, even though in the 60s we're pretty much done. Octavian, you might know him as the Emperor Augustus. Octavian will defeat Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt, as William Shakespeare famously tells us. And Augustus will then be alive and the emperor when Jesus is born, and he will reign till about 14 AD. And that gets us up to speed, right? There's our 4 kingdoms. And so then as we dive into our text in Daniel chapter 1, we see a goat. And I don't know why, or a ram, sorry. I don't know why Alexander is going to be a goat. I don't know if that's an inside joke. We can debate that later. I haven't heard a definitive answer that I thought was really convincing, but it's a goat. And so we start off with the ram, which is going to be our Medo-Persian Empire. So Daniel is in Susa when he sees this, and we're given a time. It's in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. A vision came to me, Daniel. So at this point, the Medo-Persian Empire hasn't conquered Babylon yet, but Daniel is in a place that the Babylonians don't control. Is he on some kind of mission, maybe a diplomatic mission, trying to work out peace between these 2 warring nations? Quite possibly. We're not sure. We just know that either he is in a place that isn't Babylon, Susa, at this point in time, is not controlled by Babylon, or this is part of his vision. He just sees himself in Susa because later it's going to be an important city in the empire that kind of rolls through where he is. We're not sure. It's hard to tell sometimes where people are when they're talking, especially when they start having visions. It seems to me that he's probably on a diplomatic mission. That makes the most sense to me, given the politics going on between all the vying empires at the time. And his mission is not going to be successful, interestingly enough, if that's what he was doing, because of what he sees in these visions, right? The Babylonian Empire is going to fall. We know that from the vision of the beasts. We know that from the vision of the statue. It is going to fall. So that we know that this diplomacy is not going to work. Well, then he sees the nation that is coming to conquer Babylon, and he's going to see this ram. And I saw in this vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal, which is there in Susa. I raised my eyes, and behold, a ram standing at the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high. You can see that in the yellow text. But one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last, or remained. And we're going to be told later in the book that this is actually the Medo-Persian Empire. And so what we're not going to do is we're not going to go ahead and talk about all these things and what they mean yet, because we'd repeat ourselves in a bit. So we're just going to go through and look at what we actually see and try and picture it in your mind. The point of Daniel telling you, of recording what he sees, is so that you can close your eyes and you can envision it yourself. So what you've got right now is a ram standing by a canal with two horns. And one horn, they're both big, but one horn is a lot bigger than the other. It's a lopsided ram. You can kind of picture how his head might be cocked over as he's there grazing by the canal. Well, he'll be ready. And then he is going to charge westward, northward, and southward. So this ram splits in three directions and goes. It's interesting that he doesn't say he charged westward and then northward and then southward. He does all of it at the same time. So that's really hard to imagine unless the ram just gets huge, right? Well, he doesn't say that, but that's the only way in my mind, without kind of having more than one ram, that I can envision this. So in my mind, what I see is this ram that's got his head cocked to one side, growing and just charging forth furiously, but he's become so mighty and big and powerful that he goes in all those directions at once. And so that's what you're seeing. Now imagine a beast like that, but while that's happening, and no beast can stand before him, and so beasts are kings right now, or empires, no beast can stand before him, and no one could be rescued from his power. He became great, and he did as he pleased, there in the red text. So while he's seeing this, or he's just seen this, and now he's pondering what's been going on, the next thing that we're going to see is a goat come from the west. And now, again, we're going to be told in just a bit that it's Alexander, or the Macedonian Empire. Why a goat? Why not the leopard again? Nobody knows, right? We're not told specifically why a goat. It's kind of easy to make the connection there with the ram, but again, I haven't heard a really convincing reason why you've got a goat, unless like it's just kind of a joke on Alexander's looks. Not sure. So what we've got is this goat coming from the west. And when you read through the discussion of what this goat is going to do, the ram, or this goat, is going to come with great power. And where's our goat? All right, while I was standing there, a male goat came from the west in the yellow text across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. So now envision, coming from the west, a goat with a giant horn, a conspicuous horn coming out from between its eyes, this big forehead horn coming out, almost like a unicorn, but a goat unicorn. And it's coming at you, but it's flying. And so it's a flying goat unicorn charging eastward, coming to attack the ram with two horns. And so if you can picture this in your mind and envision what's going on, you can kind of get a feel for what Daniel is seeing and what we're doing by imagining these things, by letting the pictures become what we focus on. We are training ourselves to learn how to understand apocalyptic literature. You are meant to hear the hoofbeats of the ram as it goes to meet the flying goat. You are meant to hear the clash of the horns as the large conspicuous horn locks with the two large horns, but one bigger than the other. You're meant to hear the snorting and the breathing as the animals struggle, and the pain and the agony as the goat overcomes the ram. It's supposed to become a living picture for you. And that's what John is going to do in the book of Revelation. You're going to get very vivid, very powerful images that you're supposed to see. And so as you read these visions in Daniel or other apocalyptic literature like Revelation, it is something that is meant to be heard with the eyes closed. And what I mean is it's supposed to be something you imagine. And in opening up your imagination, you are allowing yourself to see the vision for what it is and to draw from it the points that are being made. Sometimes we want to dissect all of the images and try and get details out of every single little thing, and it's not always the point in an apocalyptic image for everything to be a detail. Now, when they get explained, but sometimes it's part of the picture. Or you're supposed to get what's being said from other images that have been explained previously. And so what you see here again in the underlined part is that this ram is coming, or this goat is coming with powerful wrath. Again, the Greeks hated the Persians. They just loathed them. And he's coming, he is enraged against him and struck the ram and breaks his horns. And the ram has no power to stand before him, and he cast him down, and no one could rescue the goat from the ram's power. And the goat's going to become exceedingly great. But when he is strong, the great horn is broken. All right, so now we're getting to the point where Alexander is dying. And then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And now out of them came one little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. So the south is going to be, if we're thinking of where Daniel was in Susa, to the south of that, down the Arabian Peninsula, and then to the east, out into Egypt, and then toward the glorious land, or even up into Asia Minor, it would be to the east. And then the glorious land is going to be down to Jerusalem, down to Judea. And so this is going to grow great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars throw it down to the ground and they trample on them. So now you've got this little horn now that has grown into a great horn on this goat that has now 4 horns, and it is going to be trampling stars. It's going to tear stars down out of the sky and begin trampling on them. It is going to become great, even as great as the Prince of the Hosts, God. It is going to become even as great as God. Now, in a vision, when somebody says that some king or empire is going to become as great as God, you have to say, well, what, how, what, huh? And basically, the goat thinks it's as great as God. It is what we're getting at. And we'll see that that does indeed play out later. Nobody is as great as God. And so when you're told that someone is, it's a conceit, right? It is something that they think, even though it's not really true. So the regular burnt offering will be taken away. The place of the sanctuary will be overthrown, and a host will be given over it together. Together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. So some great group of people are going to be given over to this conspicuous, this horn that has grown up, this little horn that became big, and it will throw down a host of people with the burnt offerings, and the horn is going to ask and prosper. And then Daniel is going to hear 2 holy ones speaking, probably angels or angelic messengers, and one is going to ask, how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering and the transgression that makes desolate, the sin that makes desolate? And so right now when you hear that, the sin that makes desolate, whose sins would cause desolation in the Holy Land? Whose sins would cause the regular burnt offerings at the temple to be stopped? God isn't going to destroy Jerusalem because the Gentiles sinned. He's going to do these things because the Israelites, the Hebrews, the Jews were sinning. And so there's a transgression that causes desolation. And so the sins of the people are bringing destruction. So whatever he is seeing, Daniel is seeing here, ultimately the reason for all of these things is because of the transgressions of the people. And the sanctuary is going to be trampled, the sanctuary and the host is going to be trampled underfoot because of the sins of the people. Right? And we see that happened in 586. With the Babylonian destruction of the temple. It's going to happen in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. And so what do we think we're probably talking about here? Somebody is going to go to Jerusalem and cause a bunch of trouble because the Hebrew people are sinning. That's what we're being told. That's the question. How long is this going to be happening because of the people's sins that causes this desolation? The response is going to be for 2,300 evenings and mornings. For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. So what are we talking about when we get to these 2,300 evenings and mornings? Well, there are some diverging opinions here. Something is going to happen in the sanctuary. And the word sanctuary there is a broader word than temple. It probably refers to the land of Judea itself, including the temple and the host, which would be the people. These hosts, the stars that are being the host of heaven that are being trampled underfoot, are we're going to see explicitly stated for us later. It's probably the people who live in the land who have been sinning, and now they're being persecuted or they're being punished at the hands of a Gentile nation. That's pretty much the story of the Judges. It's a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament. We've just seen it with Babylon. We see it at the end with Rome, and now we're seeing it again with some other Grecian, Macedonian power. And so for 2,300 days and nights, what's going to happen? It's roughly 6 years and 4 months. If you do the math and you divide it out, it's roughly 6 years and 4 months. And if you're looking at it from a thematic image, first of all, it's not quite 7 years, is it? When you're Hebrew, the fullness of time, or a full measure of time, is 7. 7 days in a week. There are 7 years to bring the Sabbath of the land. There are 7 sevens to ultimately wind up in that 50th year, the Jubilee year. And so if you're a Hebrew, they count decades with series of sevens, whereas we're used to tens. And so the fullness of time would have been a 7-year period. And so this isn't quite all the way. But whatever is happening is going to be severe, but there's still more coming later. And if we're dealing with the Maccabean era, where you have Antiochus, which we'll talk about him in just a minute, if you're dealing with that, the thing that's coming later, the full judgment, the divine wrath upon the Jewish people, is going to come in 70 AD. And I think we're going to see that as we move down into the rest of the text of the chapter. And so what you're looking at here is basically the period of time from Daniel now in Babylon up until the coming of the Messiah and the ultimate end of the Jewish nation in 70 AD. That's the time period that Daniel is looking at. And so when he talks about things like the end or the latter times, that's what we're moving towards. The latter times are going to be from whenever this Grecian thing is happening up until the destruction, the coming end of the Messiah. And so when you get to the New Testament and you're reading about the last days or the latter times, Daniel has defined that for us from the time of this Grecian incident up until the final destruction that is going to come in 70 AD. That's our last days, latter times. Of course, those phrases can be used in a variety of ways, but as pertains to Daniel's visions, that's what we're looking at. And I think we'll see that play out as we go through the rest of the text. So what's going on with Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, is he is going to come in 175. He'll come to power. He is going to begin persecuting the people in 171 BC. And he dies in 163-ish BC. The dates are a little hard to figure out sometimes. So 171 to 163 is when he dies. It's about 6 years and 4 months. It's 2,300 days. And the reason why 171 is important is because that is when he begins persecuting Judea. And so when Daniel is told this is going to happen for about 2,300 days, and then you look in history and you see Antiochus Epiphanes doing some terrible things in Judea for about 2,300 days, and then he dies, that's really significant. So let's look now, right? That's our image. Now let's go into the interpretation. So in verse 15, we're going to be told the interpretation. And it's really important that when we get to this, that we have to be careful that we don't leave what Daniel is being told. And if we do, we have to be really careful, because as we're going through, when we look in our text, Daniel really doesn't understand what's going on. And if there's one thing that I glean from the book of Daniel, it's that he's a whole lot smarter than me, right? He is renowned for wisdom, for insight. He can tell dreams. I mean, the guy knows stuff. And if he can't tell what's going on, I better be really careful if I go past what Daniel is told. Because I'm pretty sure that if it was easy to figure out, he would have. So we just have to be cautious as we're moving forward. So Daniel doesn't understand what he is going to be shown. And in verse 15, he's going to seek to understand it. And so if you look in our biblical text, that's what we see. I sought to understand it, and I stood before, and then there stood before me one having the appearance of man, and it's going to be Gabriel, who is told to make Daniel, understand this vision. And so Gabriel is going to come, and Gabriel tells him something that is really important. This vision, O Son of Man, this vision is for the time of the end. Well, the time of the end of what? When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep, and my face fell to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up, and he said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation. Now that indignation there, that word, indignation, is a technical word for the wrath and fury that God pours out upon his people when they sin. And so the latter end of the indignation is the end of the time when God is judging his people for their sins. Right? That's what he was just told. What he is being shown is about the latter end of the indignation. And it deals with this time when Greece is going to come and oppress the people of Judah, where the Messiah will come. And then there's going to be something coming later after that, as we'll get down into the rest of the text. So what is happening is the time of the end. But again, we have to ask, the end of what? We'll see. So, as refers to the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. I love it when we're just told who everything is. The goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken and the place which for arose, 4 kingdoms will arise from his nation, but not with his power. Now, if you didn't know what was going to happen with the Grecian Empire, and you're being told about this one great king who is broken, and then 4 horns come in his place, you wouldn't quite know what to make of it. But with most things, hindsight is 2020. And here, we can look and we can see that when Alexander the Great dies and doesn't have a strong heir in place, the people in charge of the military split the empire into four. And this is exactly what Daniel is saying, except Daniel is saying this like 200 years before it happens. Right? So the great horn is going to be broken. Four others are going to rise up. And at the latter end of their kingdom, as those kingdoms are coming to a close, the latter end, which would be the second half, at least the second half, the latter end of those kingdoms, when the transgressors have reached their limit. And now these transgressors, who are they? Well, all through the text so far, as we're talking about God's indignation being poured out, as the time of God's punishment upon transgression, it's the Jewish people. And so the transgressors who are reaching their limit, it's not the Greeks. That's not the narrative that we're being told. It's not the history of the people of Greece. It's the Hebrew people. As the transgressions begin to get as bad as they can, then these things are going to happen. A king bold of face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. So what we're getting to now is this one who is coming, this little horn who is coming. He is going to come in when the Hebrew people have gotten to the point where their sin is not going to get too much worse. Now, what could that possibly be referring to? Well, in the explanation of the vision, when we're told that this is talking about the time when the transgressors have reached their limit, when Antiochus comes to power, there's going to be a struggle in Jerusalem. And actually the Maccabean revolt, which is about the time we're talking about, 171, is about halfway through the Greek kingdoms. And so it's the latter time of the Greek kingdoms. The Maccabean revolt is actually going to be a struggle, historians believe, between the traditionalists and the progressives in the Jewish religion. And what is going to happen is Antiochus IV is going to be over fighting in Egypt, and this struggle is going to start in Judea. And there are people, progressives, who are very Hellenistic. They're being influenced by the Greek culture. And then there are your traditional Jews. And you can pick out who is on which side when you read through the Maccabean history based on their names. You have Judas Maccabeus, right? That very, very Hebrew. And he's fighting with people named Jason, Menaeus, very Greek. And so if you have a Greek name, you're probably a Hellenist. And if you have a Hebrew name, you're probably a traditionalist. And they're fighting over who gets to be the high priest, over who gets to rule the people, all of these different things. Antiochus is going to come and he's going to side with the Hellenists. Why? Because he's Greek. And so this battle is going to begin, the Maccabean revolt. And it happens when we get descriptions of what the Jewish people are doing. They are building Greco-Roman forms of entertainment. They're building colosseums or things like colosseums. They're building amphitheaters. They're putting on their own version of Olympic Games, honoring the Greek gods. There are reports of Jewish men having cosmetic surgery to undo their circumcisions so that they are actually no longer being Jewish. They're actually becoming Greek. They're changing themselves physically so that they can fit in with the Greeks. Whereas when you get to the New Testament, the problem is the exact opposite, right? They want the Greeks to become Jewish. But that's what's going on when all of these things are happening. And it's exactly what Daniel is saying. How greater can your transgression become than trying to undo the very nature, so to speak, of your Jewishness? Trying to undo the sign of the covenant that you have with God. It doesn't get worse than that. And so here, that's what we're seeing. And when this happens, this little horn rising up is Antiochus IV. And what's going to happen with Antiochus IV is he is going to come and he is going to cause fearful destruction. You can see this. His power shall be great. Over back to our text. His power will be great, but not his own power. So God is going to be driving him forward, using him to judge his people. His power will be great, and by his cunning and deceit, those things will prosper under his hand. In his own mind, he shall become great. Indeed, he calls himself Epiphanes, which means God in the present. So here he is, a manifestation of a God. That's what he claims to be. And so now what was said earlier, where he challenges even the prince of the hosts, or he makes himself greater than the prince of the hosts, well, he's made himself a God. Right? He will rise up here in the gray text that's highlighted on the screen. He will rise up even against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. In other words, this isn't happening next week, Daniel. This isn't happening in a little while, Daniel. This is happening at some point in the future. This is about things, events you aren't going to see. So seal them up and keep it safe and make sure that people, when these things happen, people know that this is what's going on. And now the reason why this is important, right? The reason why Daniel needs to know this is because there are going to be many people who are destroyed, right? Mighty men are going to be destroyed, and the people who are the saints. That's the Jewish people. They are going to be destroyed. Antiochus is going to come, and he's going to commit atrocities. He is going to murder people. He's going to mayhem and destruction. It is judgment all over again. Babylon, redo, right, is coming, and here it is. But God will stop it before it is complete. He will not allow it to get to the point that it is not recoverable yet. And so he stops it. And by no human hand, this reign will end. And as we said earlier, Antiochus will die in 163, 6 years, 4 months after he begins persecution in 171 BC. And it's not by human hand. And so this promise here in verse 26, the vision in the evenings and the mornings is true, but seal it up. That's right. It's so distressing, however, that when Daniel sees this, he is overcome and he lays sick for days. He is appalled by the vision, and he doesn't understand it. He knows that destruction is coming upon his nation. He knows that bad things are going to happen to his people, but he doesn't understand all the particulars yet. How could he? How can he know that we're talking about Alexander the Great, whose kingdom will be split into 4 kingdoms, and one of those, the Seleucid Empire, is going to take control of the Middle East in about 198, and then a king, Antiochus IV, is going to raise up and call himself God and commit great atrocities and sacrifice a pig on the altar in the temple and end temple worship. How can he know these things? How can he know that Judas Maccabeus is going to come and begin the Maccabean revolt and take the temple back and restore it, and then by the end, cleanse the land? And there will be, in a way, a renewal that comes, a revival of seeking and serving God, but not completely. And the people are going to remain in transgression and continue to do worse and worse things. How can he make sense of that? He can't completely yet. He doesn't understand it. And so what we have is the benefit of history, looking backwards. But we can see now that the time of the end is defined for us. It is the time at which the judgment of God is complete upon his people. And that's going to get us into chapter 9. So in chapter 9, what's happening now is Daniel is realizing that the 70-year period is coming to a close. Right? When he's writing now, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, a descendant of a Mede, who is made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived. And so you're dealing with 539, 538-ish, around the same time that the decree is given for the Jews to return, where Zerubbabel and Joshua go back, and there is a large number of people who are going. It's about this time that Daniel says, hey, you know what? I think I remember reading in Jeremiah about a 70-year period. And so he goes and he reads and he looks, and he's going to pray. After reading Jeremiah and seeing that the events are unfolding before him, he has been in Babylon since 605, and so it's 538-ish now. He knows that we're getting close, and he prays to God. And what we see after his reading of Jeremiah is he's going to start praying for the sins of the people. So look over in Daniel chapter 9 in verse 4. And we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to go slightly faster than I would like to, but we've got to get finished. So in verse 4, I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, so here we've got Daniel confessing sins. Whose sins is he going to confess? Well, first he begins by exalting the Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, right? For his covenant people. We have sinned. Look in verse 5. We have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, our fathers, to all the people of the land. I find it very interesting that when Daniel comes before the Lord and he prays, he doesn't say, those people. Lord, forgive those people. But what we see, very similar to Jesus' parable of the Pharisee and the publican, or the Pharisee and the tax collector, we see the tax collector in Daniel. Right? The man who's beating his chest, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. Whereas the Pharisee points at other people. Look at them, how bad they are. Daniel doesn't exclude himself from the sins of his people. And that's a lesson for us, that when we are part of a culture, it is not wrong for us to pray, right, for the forgiveness of the sins of our nation. We have gone astray. We have done this. We have done that. We don't want to separate ourselves from that. And Daniel is very sincere. He's very contrite. He includes himself in the nation of his people. And as a nation, they have done some terrible things, and he is not excluded from that group. And so here we see him coming to the Lord and praying, forgive us. Forgive us. And that is a prayer that we should be praying. Right? Forgive us of the things that we have done. Regardless of whether or not I've personally carried something out, I am part of a nation that has done things that are displeasing to the Lord. Lord, be merciful to us. And so to you, O Lord, then he's going to contrast himself and the people with God. To you, O Lord, belongs righteousness, but to us open shame, as at this day to the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to all Israel, those who are near and far away, in all the lands which you have driven them, because of the treachery they committed against you. To us, O Lord, belongs open shame, to our kings, our princes, our fathers, because we sinned against you. The thing about this prayer is he doesn't pull any punches. He's not trying to slide by untainted by sin himself. He fully recognizes that everyone has fallen short and everyone needs God's grace and God's mercy. And so what he continually does is he continually contrasts who they were with who God was. God kept the covenant. God was faithful. Israel was faithless. Israel was treacherous. But to God belong righteousness and mercy, while the Israelites were unmerciful and unloving and unkind. And so he's contrasting the actions of people with the actions of the divine God to whom they were covenanted. And so then he realizes here, down in verse 11, Israel transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And this is pretty significant. What he's praying, while he's praying for intervention, he recognizes that Israel deserved what they got. It wasn't unfair. It wasn't unjust. God warned them in the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, Moses talks about the blessings for faithfulness. He talks about the curses for disobedience. In another place, he will say, behold, I've set before you today life and death. Choose life. And Israel chose death. It's the Garden of Eden all over again. Standing before us are two trees, the tree of life and the tree of wickedness. Right? And you pick. And humanity, for whatever reason, is really good at picking that second tree. And here Daniel is admitting wrong. We sinned when we didn't listen to you. We want you to come back and rule over us. Please forgive us for what we have done. And this is Daniel's prayer. He's praying this personally. This isn't the prayer of the nation, although it should have been. This is one man praying to God, asking him to intervene. And he is talking about all these wonderful things. You know, as it is written, under the whole of heaven, there's nothing been done like has been done against Jerusalem. So this is our focus throughout all this passage, is the judgment that's on Jerusalem. Yet we have not entreated, despite all of that, we have not entreated your favor by turning from our iniquities or gaining insight by your truth, in verse 13. So the sins of the people have continued despite the judgment that has come. But now Daniel is going to entreat God and ask for God's forgiveness based on four things. So we have him saying, yes, this is exactly what the law said would happen. You were faithful to your law, even when it meant judgment against us. But starting in verse 16, Daniel is basing his petition for God's mercy on four things. The first thing he says is that God is always right, and God promised to forgive his people if they turn to him. So please, Lord, forgive us as we turn back to you. That's in the green. In the second, in the blue text, he's going to say that your holy place and your holy people have become a reproach, and that looks bad for you. So for your sake, God, redeem your people. Very similar to Moses in the wilderness when God is going to destroy Israel and start a new nation. Moses says, please don't do that because it'll make you look bad. And so Daniel's concern is really for God's standing, God's appearance before the nations. The third thing he's going to say in the yellow text there on the screen, starting in verse 18, is that God is merciful and will act with great mercy to those who seek him. So Lord, we're seeking you. Please be merciful to us. And the last thing we see in verse 19 there in that orange text is, Lord, hear and forgive, throwing himself upon God's mercies. Delay not for your own sake, Lord, for, oh my God, because your city and your people are called by your name. You have covenanted with us, God. We are your possession. Please come and care for your possession. So calling God, in a sense, back to the covenant. We've come back to you. Please come back to us. And while he's praying this, while I was speaking and praying, we see that in verse 20, he's going to get an answer from Gabriel. And so what we see in chapter 9, the beginning part of chapter 9, as Daniel is reading Jeremiah, he perceives that things are coming to an end, and he prays, and he begs for forgiveness. He asks God to intervene for the people, probably thinking of Zerubbabel and Joshua going back to Jerusalem, going to start rebuilding things. He wants God to be with them. And Gabriel is going to bring the Lord's answer. While I was confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel and presenting my plea before the Lord my God, here comes Gabriel again, right? Whom I had seen in the vision at first, this man named Gabriel, or this angel, Gabriel. And he made me understand, saying, at the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, a message, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly loved. Now, this would be very consoling, because Daniel is not about to get good news. Listen, Daniel, God loves you. He has heard your prayer. And even though he has heard your prayer, the answer is no. And sometimes when we don't get a yes to our prayers, we think God doesn't care, or God doesn't hear, or God doesn't love us. And so the angel comes, and the first thing he says is, Daniel, you are greatly loved. Please don't let the message you are about to receive make you think any other way. You are greatly loved. And we have to trust in that same thing too. The message of the gospel is that God loves you. God so loved the world that he sent his son to die so that we, through him, could be redeemed. And so when we pray and it seems like we're getting a no to our prayers, don't let that make you think that God doesn't love you. You are greatly loved. Loved so much to the point where God would pay with the blood of his own son to have you in his family, to redeem you, to adopt you, to include you in this plan of salvation put in place before the foundation of the world. God was thinking about you before there was time. You are greatly loved. Don't let what seems like a no to a prayer that you fervently pray make you think that you are any less loved than you actually are. So Daniel is told, God loves you. Now consider the word. Understand the vision. So there's this declaration that goes out, verse 24, there are 70 weeks that are decreed about your people, the holy city, to finish transgression, literally to seal transgression. And what that kind of means is it means to bring it to an end, right? To seal up transgression, to cause it to stop, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, to anoint a most holy. Now, notice how I left the word place off. Just kind of cover that up. Don't mark it out of your Bible, but just kind of cover it up because it's not there. All right, that word gets added into the text. It just says holy, and it's probably a holy one. So let's go through the yellow part. 70 weeks are decreed, 70 periods of time. Probably weeks, heptads, 70 periods of 7, are decreed about your people, your city, Jerusalem, the Jews, to finish transgression. In other words, they're sinning now. They're going to keep sinning, but there's going to be a point where their sinning is stopped. Right? We are going to put an end to sin, literally seal up sin. We're going to finish. We're going to be done with it. To atone for iniquity. There's going to be one who brings atonement. There's going to be an everlasting righteousness that comes, and the visions and the prophets, right? Everything in the Old Testament, everything that has been talked about up to this point is going to be brought to a conclusion, and there will be a holy anointed one. So Messiah is going to come, not a place. Messiah is going to come. He will fulfill what is written in the prophets. He is going to atone iniquity, to bring about everlasting righteousness amongst the people. And in that sense, put an end to sin, but also, as we're going to see, to stop the sin of the Hebrew people by ending their covenant relationship with God. Where the old covenant, what we're seeing here is the old covenant is going to be done away. They've continued in transgression, and rather than being restored at the 70 years, like Jeremiah says, we're extending that out now. we're going to go 70 times 7 years. So 490 years is where we're going. And so know, therefore, verse 25, and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, right? So 7 times 7 would be 49. There's 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks, it shall be built again with squares and a moat. So in 7 weeks or so, there's going to be a word to go out to rebuild Jerusalem. It's probably referring to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And then there's 62 weeks during which the city will be built up, but it's in a time of trouble. And so what you're seeing is the city is being rebuilt, the people are being rebuilt, but it's during a time where there's turmoil, during a time where the area is changing hands, there's revolts, there's new kings, there's the Romans coming, there's all these things happening. So it's in a troubled time, but it is being rebuilt. So 7 plus 62 is 69. And if we kind of do the math there, we've got, let's see, I've got it written out so I don't make a math mistake. We've got 483 years. There we go. I had to do the math. I couldn't find it. So 69 times 7 is 483. So if we're dealing with Ezra and Nehemiah, we have 457 BC, about the time when Ezra is going in. If you go 69 weeks into the future, 69 times 7, 483 years, you get 26 AD. 26 AD would be about the time that Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. Jesus is born in 7 BC. How do we know that? Because who was reigning? King Herod. We know that he was reigning during the reign, very particular time in which Jesus could have been born. All of those details put us at about 7 BC. That means in 26 AD, Jesus is 33. So Jesus is baptized and begins his public ministry, according to the gospel writers, when he's about 30 years old. So then, 7 years later, right, when we get to looking at the rest of the text, after 62 weeks, an anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. 7 years later, Jesus is crucified in 33 AD, making him 40 years old. It's a very significant number. So this prophecy in Daniel works out to the time of the Messiah coming in the first century in 26 AD, which is why in the first century, everybody's looking for the Messiah because they can do math too, and they have figured out that it's about now. Well, Jesus comes on the scene. He is the Messiah in 26 AD. He begins his public ministry. He's crucified in 33 AD, and he has nothing. He's cut off. And so what you see now is this is the last straw. Jesus will tell the parable of the tenants about how they rented a vineyard and they were throwing out the servants, but then the son comes and they kill him. And then he asks the question, what will be done to those tenants? What will the landowner do? He will cast them out. Right? This is the last straw. The transgression of the people has been brought to an end. There is nothing they can do worse than this. This is the end. And so from this point forward, the gospel message to the people of Israel is going to be repent, for destruction is coming. Jesus, in the end of the gospel accounts, is going to look and say, not one stone will be left upon another. Right? The abomination, Jesus will say, the abomination of desolation is coming. And that comes from this section in Daniel chapter 9. So what we see here is after these 62 weeks, the Messiah, purple section, is going to be cut off. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. It's either Babylon or Greece or Rome. And we've already passed up Babylon and Greece in our statues and with our beasts. We've got Rome left. So the people who are coming to destroy the city and the sanctuary, not to do the partial destruction, right, the 6 years and 4 months, but to do the full destruction, right? This is the end of the prophets, the end of the visions, the fulfillment of all those things, the end of the transgression and the sin of the people. That ultimate final judgment on the sin of the people is coming in 70 AD when the Roman army is going to march in, at first under the command of Vespasian, who will be sent away, and then Titus will come. Titus is going to lead the army in 70 AD and absolutely crush Judea. He is going to turn a once beautiful place into a desert wasteland. When you read the descriptions of a land flowing with milk and honey, and then you look at a map, there ain't no milk and there ain't no honey in Jerusalem. Thank you, Rome. When you look in Carthage at the northern tip over where Tunisia is, and the northern tip of Africa, that used to be a lush, idyllic, garden-like place, and now it's desert. Thank you, Rome. When God uses the Romans to destroy things, they destroy it utterly. This is the final judgment upon these people. God is telling them he is done dealing with them. Their sins and their transgressions have brought about their ultimate judgment. Desolation. Look at this. Its end shall come with a flood. That's if you're looking at the Septuagint, that's the word for cataclysm. It is a cataclysmic destruction that is coming upon these people. There will be war. Desolations are decreed. This is destruction. He will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. There's a lot of debate about that part of verse 27. Some people think it refers to Jesus and what he is doing. It could be looking back to Jesus and his earthly ministry. It could also be talking about Titus and what he is doing, about the agreements that he is making. He's going to make a strong covenant for 1 week, and then he's going to put an end to the sacrifice and offering. Well, how will he do that? By destroying the temple. And then on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, if you're reading the Septuagint, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, is on the wing shall come the abomination of desolation, which is the phrase that Jesus uses over in the New Testament, looking back to Daniel, saying these things are happening now in Jesus' time. And so what we're looking at here is not Daniel projecting out into the future, thousands of years, telling about an antichrist to come. Interestingly enough, Daniel never talks about an antichrist. Interestingly enough, in the book of Revelation, where people want to go to try and find an antichrist, John never uses the word antichrist in the book of Revelation because it's not about those things. Right? It is about what the text says it is about. It is about the sins of the people becoming so great that God is finished with them. And God is going to bring a strong people who wage war to cause desolation. And one who is the abomination of desolation is going to come and make desolate the place where sacrifices and offerings are made. Titus is coming. Rome is coming. And when you see the city surrounded by armies, you had better leave, because the time has been decreed. And this is why Daniel is sick. Because in the visions that he's gotten, he sees the destruction of his people. Imagine if you're told that everybody that you've loved, everything you've known, everything that you think makes who you are, was going to be destroyed. This is why John in the book of Revelation, when he hears these things, he gets sick to his stomach. Because he's Jewish. And hearing that his people, his home, his heritage will be wiped off the face of the earth is a distressing thing to hear. And it might make you think, I'm not loved, except, Daniel, you are greatly loved. Now hear the word. And in the middle of all this destruction, this death, this mayhem, is this great hope. This is the time of Messiah. He is coming, the anointed one, to deliver his people. Because when you go back to the beginning of the explanation, right, not only, he's not just talking darkness and destruction and mayhem. There is one who is coming who will put an end to sin, who will atone for iniquity, who will bring everlasting righteousness, who will finish what is written in the law and the prophets and the Psalms, who will anoint, and a holy one will be anointed. Right? This is the hope. In the middle of this darkness, in the middle of sin, and that's the issue, sin is being judged. In the middle of sin, there is hope. In the middle of darkness, there is a light shining among the Gentiles, and they will have hope. In the middle of great pain and scourging, there is one who offers himself, becomes a servant of all, so that through his stripes we might be healed. This is what the Bible is all about. And to take this and make it about somebody besides Jesus is to do violence to the text. To take this and make it about something besides the time of Messiah, who is ushering in the end of the old and the birth of this new covenant where all can enter in and all can come to God and be reconciled to God and have relationship with God. It does violence to the text. It does violence to the entire purpose of the scriptures. And what we're seeing here is the hope to which we are called. People will abandon God, but Messiah comes, and Messiah will never abandon you. And if you are faithful to him, no matter what happens, no matter what comes, you are one of the Lord's holy ones. You are part of the family, adopted in because of this Holy One who is coming and what he will do. That's what it's about. That's what Daniel's looking forward to. So we've got 3 more chapters to go through, 10, 11, and 12. We'll do that next week. From me and my family to all of you, God bless you, and we love you. Merry Christmas, as our culture kind of celebrates the coming of the Messiah. There's no biblical evidence as to when that happens, but it's a good thing regardless of when it does, and that is what Daniel is talking about. That is where Daniel leaves us as we get into chapter 10, 11, and 12 next week. God bless you. I love you, and we'll see you all soon.